Hi there, my name is Pierre Terrien, and this video is meant to offer you a different way to look at man-made climate change. Come with me. We'll ride around Vancouver, look at the sights, and I'll tell you all about it. So here's the short story. This is not a climate crisis. This is a commercial waste CO2 emergency. Under this proposal, the gasoline, diesel, or kerosene we use will have no carbon footprint. We will create a marketplace for commercial waste CO2 emissions that will remove this pollution. Everything we do, from manufacturing steel or cement, and all our other commercial processes will automatically become net zero. I'll give you some background to frame the problem, and then I'll explain how it works. The Paris Accord accepts a 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise, causing a 20-meter ocean level rise. The United States suffers terribly under climate change. You lose your entire coastline, $70 trillion worth of asset losses. The Midwest and California burn as desertification sets in. What isn't washed away, it seems, will be burned to a cinder. There is an easy way to end the destruction of our biosphere, and it is easy to understand. One solution where we eliminate all of our environmental problems and we don't have to change our lifestyles at all. The drive for money is okay, but when greed comes at the expense of the biosphere, something has to change. I would like to explain exactly what that is. Man-made climate change is caused by our commercial waste CO2 emissions. Let's look at how and why.
The old hockey stick graph shows atmospheric CO2 concentration over the last 800,000 years. It's never exceeded 300 parts per million before, but since the mid-1800s, it's begun a rapid increase that is currently a trend leading to an extinction level event. So what's been going on here? This closer look at more recent atmospheric CO2 concentration and emissions rates shows commercial activities creating CO2 as a byproduct beginning with the Industrial Revolution, thus leading to our increased atmospheric CO2 concentration. This is where we went wrong. Our commercial activity emits CO2 as a byproduct as people pay more and more for the products and services that produce CO2. This process, funded by the public to simply dump these gases into the atmosphere, was initiated here. At the time, anyone could see the waste coming from our new smokestacks, but it was much cheaper to ignore the problem. Most visible pollutants have now been eliminated from much of our society, leaving CO2 waste as our main problem. We figured we would just see what happened. What else could we have done? We were just happy to switch from whale oil to coal, then oil and gas. Fossil fuels have been our steady friend, providing us with heat, energy, and light to strengthen our civilization. This open cycle process relies on the biosphere to somehow deal with CO2 through processes like photosynthesis. It's no secret the biosphere is overwhelmed with our open cycle CO2 production.
I propose we close the waste CO2 cycle, thus ending man-made climate change. The following animation shows the open cycle process we operate now and the closed cycle process we must adopt to rid ourselves of CO2 waste.
This commercial waste CO2 comes from commercial activities, such as beef production and fossil fuels, etc. When beef farming began commercial production at an increasing volume during the 1800s, farmers didn't know the waste was hazardous. Early commercial activities had no way to collect this waste, and emissions were generally thought to have no biosphere effect. We now produce some 40 gigatons of greenhouse gas every year from all sources. This waste CO2 is expected to be processed in the biosphere by natural processes such as photosynthesis, and the biosphere cannot possibly keep up. Atmospheric CO2 concentration continues its rapid rise, acidifying the biosphere, warming it, leading to sea level rise and desertification of much of the Earth's landmass. To put the shit back in the cow seems difficult, but we now recognize CO2 is harmful and we must remove all of it. But how? To figure out how to close the cycle on commercial CO2, imagine a carbon tax, sized to remove the CO2 emissions, and apply this tax to those CO2 sources. CO2 taxes will now fund commercial drawdown, which removes all of our ongoing emissions, plus or old pollution, and all excess CO2 from feedback effects. The CO2 will then go to supply other processes and activities harmlessly. For example, for each barrel of oil we pump out of the ground, a known amount of CO2 is produced. Require oil producers to pay for that much CO2 removal at the marketplace cost. The marketplace is currently between $100 and $600 per ton. For commercial beef production, the same strategy is applied, with each kilogram of beef being taxed for the known CO2 equivalent to methane produced. We will remove enough CO2 to make up for the methane created. Drawdown capacity will be built that will process the atmosphere, thus eliminating excess CO2. We achieve net zero as soon as we choose this strategy because the carbon tax will immediately devote enough resources to remove all emissions. Now we can see the closed cycle process, thus correcting the problem humanity created by operating the open cycle process. It doesn't really matter which method we use to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. There are a multitude of commercial drawdown options. Instead, trade CO2 in the marketplace as a commodity. The value will float freely, with that value pegged at the cost of CO2 drawdown. Once the government legislates the full marketplace carbon tax, commercial enterprises will happily draw down the waste CO2 in the cheapest way possible to maximize their profits. Oil producers and other emitters will pay full price, their emissions will be eliminated, and oil refineries and other drawdown industries will be paid for the CO2 they eliminate. The people working in oil and gas will be needed to create the capture technology at their refineries, and also the vast commercial CO2 drawdown market, which will be paid the removal tax to do so. Our energy sources help us maintain the light of civilization. Fossil fuels have literally lifted billions of humans out of poverty. We should thank the fine people from oil, gas, and coal for making all of our lives better. I'm sure they will be only too happy to turn their efforts to producing even more energy to scrub our atmosphere clean.
Some hard-headed people think that we need to get the Chinese or India to act first, to do something, because they are the worst polluters. This is utter nonsense. Third world countries require just as much time to industrialize as any other. We've had plenty of time to refine our technologies, and yet we had to learn the hard way by living through terrible smog. Californian ingenuity has led the way for quite some time. That's why the smog got so bad. The fact is, China has already realized that climate change will have to be dealt with. California has always led the way with emission standards. The Chinese have benefited immensely from the technological and scientific advancements from America. The Chinese will simply end up doing exactly what the Americans have discovered to do. It will be their own choice how that occurs. That's why emission standards have advanced the most in California, and why Chinese cars are being built using emission standards pioneered by Californian ingenuity. So the situation we have on our hands is this: California must lead the way, or wherever the center of our civilization is. Who holds the light of our civilization? They will decide to end pollution. The rest of the world will follow, China and India included. They will close the waste cycle. The only question is when. Many people are appalled at the level of human consumption of energy and resources. Our consumption is a problem because we're dumping our waste CO2 emissions into the atmosphere as if it were some kind of garbage dump. When we close the waste gas cycle, it will no longer matter how much we consume. All of humanity will have no carbon footprint. Placing an accurate cost on the CO2 sources effectively makes all sources of CO2 responsible for the pollution they generate. Consider the social costs of environmental breakdown. The social costs of uncontrolled environmental breakdown are currently being applied in a manner which is inconsistent on humanity and on the environment. All of society contributes to the problem, yet those people on our coastlines, or in areas under desertification, or in areas where intensified weather events are occurring, are suffering all of the negative effects of our commercial waste. To level that playing field, we must eradicate all of these problems concurrently, whilst ensuring each person is able to contribute to the solution based on the magnitude of our individual contributions to the problem. This is effectively accomplished by ensuring the cost of eliminating the hazards are placed accurately on those generating the hazards. Applying the carbon tax on CO2 producers at the sources will place the true cost of our impact on the environment squarely on the sources. To do this, the carbon tax becomes the market cost incurred to remove the CO2 from the environment, thus controlling the environment to the conditions we choose and thereby eliminating the social cost of our environmental problems. Net zero is only truly achieved when commercial drawdown removes all commercial CO2 emissions. Natural processes such as photosynthesis should not have to somehow adapt to achieve net zero. There is a cost to pollution, and where pollution cannot be captured at the source, the cost is however much it takes to remove that pollution from the atmosphere. A cost of $200 per ton is not a difficult burden for the middle class and elite. They won't even notice. It will raise gasoline costs about 50 cents a liter or $2 a gallon, and beef costs will go up about $3 per pound. Jet fuel will become more expensive too. A return flight from Paris to New York will increase by about $170. Since this cost will now go to fund removal, creating a vast infrastructure project, I argue there is no real cost, because the money will only go to broaden the middle class, thus increasing the size of the tax base. Sure, the cost of some things will go up, but the cost will now truly reflect the environmental damage each product or service imposes.
We've seen where past atmospheric CO2 emissions have taken us, so let's map out where atmospheric concentrations are going. The carbon tax will eradicate biospheric damage in a practical way by bringing atmospheric CO2 concentration under control, overriding all known feedback effects, removing the vast amount of past emissions, and finally to a set point of around 320 parts per million, or that which supports the atmospheric temperature we choose. We will accomplish this by reducing the CO2 emission rate, as the carbon tax will force all emitters to capture CO2 at the sources, and the emissions rate will fall to the level of our ongoing emissions. The carbon tax will fund removal, and the removal rate should rise to 30 gigatons per year for 50 years to support the required atmospheric set point. The removal rate will then fall to roughly the magnitude of our ongoing CO2 emissions from sources such as concrete, steel production, fertilizers, beef production, etc. As you can see, by 2140, atmospheric temperature will be at set point.
We can utilize this section of the CO2 emissions curve to pay for the large bulk of commercial drawdown devices and equipment. And rightly so. Oil and gas industries created this problem to a large extent, as they have enabled our total consumption to spiral upwards, and are also quite well positioned to assume a large part of the construction and operation of this vast new industry.
We have solved this problem before. Look at sulfur dioxide emissions. We used to dump sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere at alarming rates, causing sulfuric acid to fall as acid rain. Now, this yellow pile behind me demonstrates how we simply dissociate the sulfur out and use it as feedstocks for such things as fertilizers. We can treat carbon dioxide the same way we treat sulfur dioxide. We can use the dissociated carbon as building materials, fuel, and fill. It will all find its way to harmless places where our carbon will be turned into other valuable products. Hence, the amount of CO2 emissions will be quantified, the carbon tax placed squarely on the sources, and thus eliminating all of the costs of environmental breakdown. The carbon tax should not be applied to people. It should be applied to commercial CO2 emissions. That way, people who don't purchase any of the products or services that produce CO2 will pay no carbon tax. How would humanity initiate such a process? Create a marketplace for CO2 emissions. This will place a carbon tax or levy on commercial CO2 producers at the sources. It is easy to identify the sources and tax them for the CO2 they produce. Oil producers will pay the tax, and any entity removing the CO2 will be paid the tax. Hence, oil refineries capturing CO2 will receive the tax, provided they process the CO2 into some other form, just like any other commercial drawdown facility. Phase in this levy over 10 years, starting in 3 years. That's 3 years to reflect that in year 4, the price of products and services will have the first 10% of their cost factored in. No one has to be pressured into buying a new EV because, on average, the automobile fleet changes over every 13 years anyway. This price on carbon will drive down fossil fuel use because we have competitive alternatives. This will allow us to continue using oil and gas industries to their end of life, extracting most of the value from our installed and manufactured equipment. Meanwhile, a vast requirement for infrastructure, including energy generation and carbon capture facilities, will be required. Our society requires a new direction post-COVID-19, and this strategy provides that opportunity. No matter how far we reduce humanity's gaseous waste emissions, we are still guilty of expecting the biosphere to somehow adapt to those leftover waste emissions. The biosphere should simply not have to adapt to our waste emissions. It doesn't matter how we feel about that, but future humans will in no way accept anything less than the total elimination of all pollution. The cost is well within our resource limits, and the sooner we take this responsibility, the lesser the total area under the curve is, and therefore the less the expense is. Expense only the biosphere will suffer.
The rate of total damage to the biosphere we are committing financially is infinitely high right now. We are losing species. It will continue to be priceless until commercial drawdown exceeds the emissions rate, here around 2035. The current total savings from freely exhausting this waste into the biosphere is arguably the financial damage we are causing to the biosphere. 40 gigatons a year times $600 per ton is a vast amount. Under a 50-year drawdown period, the total amount we spend is arguably the financial damage, savings, profit we are committing to destroy the biosphere to get to this point. If the cost remains the same, $600 per ton, it will end at around 8 gigatons per year times $600 per ton. I would need help to calculate how much that is per year until the atmospheric concentration reaches 275 parts per million, where we can say biosphere damage has been halted. That must truly be a vast amount. I like to think of that as the available resources to build the commercial equipment that will be required. Regardless, the actual cost will be whatever it takes to produce the 50-year drawdown rate or better. Then we move on to ongoing drawdown. Whatever the total cost is, it is at least equivalent to the total value of all the commercial drawdown construction and operations, at least until the atmospheric concentration reaches this level around 2110. Operations beyond that point are the simple ongoing cost of our emissions, but those emissions will no longer do any damage. Atmospheric CO2 concentration will be at a set point regardless of the quantity of our ongoing emissions. Now consider a 100-year drawdown period. Priceless costs continue until 2050. Funds devoted to biosphere damage continue to 2170. The total area under the curve must be a truly monstrous amount of financial profit, damage, savings, dependent on your point of view.
How will we implement a carbon dioxide marketplace? Take control. Greta Thunberg was right to question the United Nations Secretary General about how we might survive. Greta deserves an answer, one that makes sense. To end this existential threat, use social media. Tweet this strategy to Greta Thunberg. Make her aware that there is a simple strategy that will end all biosphere destruction in the most aggressive manner possible. The biosphere deserves nothing less than our very best. The biosphere deserves nothing less than our best. Humanity must take control of important parameters such as atmospheric CO2 concentration. Humanity will thus lead a leave-no-trace existence on this planet because that is how we survive. Greta has access to the politicians that can restore the balance of waste in our environment. Encourage Greta to return to the United Nations and assert that we do survive, and that the way is to end all pollution. Everyone wonders what will come with the future. We make assumptions and test out our theories, but if we are advocating for a plan or a solution, then the very first assumption we need to make about the future is that we survive. In fact, we are meant to thrive. Provided we end all pollution, nothing can stop us. Humanity stands at the foot of unlimited expansion. We can create any amount of energy we require. We can scrub CO2 from the atmosphere at any rate we choose, and we can restore the biosphere to any condition we choose. My name is Pierre Terrien, and all I'm asking is that you tweet and retweet this message to Greta Thunberg. Empower Greta to create a marketplace for CO2 emissions and end this existential threat. Let's close the cycle on waste CO2 emissions.